It's really wonderful to see you all. Welcome to the Maudlin Center for the Arts. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kevin Hallock. I'm a professor of economics and president of the University of Richmond, and I'm delighted that you're joining us here tonight for our 2026 Sharp Viewpoint Speaker Series event, AI and the Future of Work. Thank you to everyone who made this program possible. I'm grateful to colleagues from the Maudlin Center, University Communications, University Catering, and the Office of the President. And I'm also grateful to the person who inspired our Sharp series, Richard Lee Sharp. Mr. Sharp was a visionary. He studied computer science and electrical engineering and was considered a computer whiz back in the 1980s. He invented things, he led, revolutionized, and founded new companies, defying skeptics. And he gave back by mentoring aspiring leaders and serving on the university's board of trustees. 15 years ago, the Sharp Viewpoint Speaker Series was established in his honor to present competing views on topics crucial to our society. It's such a shame that he could not be here with us today. I'm sure that he would have great ideas for how to use AI to make our lives better. In a few moments, we will welcome two brilliant economists who've thought about this topic a lot: how the continued development of artificial intelligence will impact the labor market, and what that might mean for human flourishing more broadly. Our guests do not agree about everything. In fact, on some topics, they strongly disagree. I surely won't agree with everything they will say, and you might not agree with them either. For instance, I recognize that many in our audience may have serious ethical concerns about AI. There are questions about how using AI may affect the cultivation of relationships, critical thinking, creativity, and more. But if we just spoke with people we agreed with, I don't think we'd make much progress. And if we only invited speakers to our campus who everyone agreed with, I'm sure we wouldn't ask anyone to come. At the University of Richmond, we celebrate the vigorous exchange of ideas, and I believe we will demonstrate that this evening. AI, as I mentioned, I'm also an economist, and I'm also trying to learn as much as I can about AI. I'm proud of the work that so many in our campus are doing in this area. At UR, we're thinking about AI in at least three ways. First, student outcomes. What should the university do to prepare students for success in an AI-enabled world? Second, academics. How should the university support faculty across schools and disciplines who wish to explore AI as a topic or use AI as a tool to augment their teaching, research, or creative production? And third, operations. How could the university use AI to enhance our operations, support our staff, and maximize our mission? There's a lot of work already underway, and a new presidential advisory group led by our provost and chief information officer is continuing to think strategically about this. So the topic of our program today could not be more timely, and we are in a tricky time. As university leaders across the country look ahead, we can see that a demographic cliff has begun. And in the last decade, fewer students will graduate from high school, and even fewer are likely to invest in a college education. As a result, many colleges will not enroll enough students to remain open. I'm not a meteorologist, but I also believe that an AI tsunami is coming. AI technologies will change many things about our daily lives. And a storm is developing which will be very, very damaging to many universities. But the University of Richmond will surely not be immune, and we will need to make changes. But I have a lot of confidence that we are as well positioned as any university to weather that storm and, in fact, thrive. I believe that studying the liberal arts and exploring what it means to be human is as profound and important today as it ever was. And I believe that our university's small class sizes and strong mentoring relationships will continue to make Richmond a very valuable education in an AI-enabled world. In fact, I'm excited to discover ways AI can substantially advance our mission. Through events like this one and continued conversations all over our campus, I hope we can find some new ways to think about emerging technologies so that together we can continue to prepare our community and our students for an even brighter future. Now I'm delighted to turn today's program, welcome our guests, and hear what they think about all of this. We are lucky to have them here. Anton Korinek, although clearly younger than David and me, has quickly emerged as a star in this area. He's a professor, dedicated teacher, and advisor at the University of Virginia. He's an influential researcher who has received dozens of awards and fellowships in, well, you guys came out already, in convened conferences around the world. And his influence reaches far beyond academia. You guys can sit, it's okay. Go ahead and sit. Anton has testified at the US Senate. He served on a panel of AI experts for the G7 summit. He's served on the National Science Foundation's Economic Advisory Council. He currently serves on Anthropic's Economic Advisory Council, and he contributed to and edited the Oxford Handbook on AI Governance. For these and many more reasons, Time magazine last year named him to their list of 100 most influential people in artificial intelligence. I specifically found his paper, Artificial Intelligence and Its Implications for Income Distribution and Unemployment, a paper central to our discussion today, thought-provoking. I'm also thrilled that David Autor is here. David's a professor at MIT, where he's also a celebrated teacher and advisor. For decades, he's been a monumental figure in the field of economics. In 2019, The Economist magazine named him the economic voice of the American worker. That same year, the TV host John Oliver recognized David in his late night show as that twerpy MIT economist in a segment on automation and employment. I'm not sure you need some redundancies maybe, as an economist. I first met David in January of 1999 at the American Economic Association meetings. I was a fourth-year assistant professor at the University of Illinois, and I was visiting that year Princeton University. I was teaching there for the year. And the job market meetings were in Philadelphia, and there was a huge snowstorm. And so no one else from Illinois made it to Philadelphia. So I had to interview all of the job market candidates, something like 25 of them, over 3 or 4 days by myself. David and I met and talked for a half an hour in the conference room. I told him I had absolutely no authority to do this, but the University of Illinois would be delighted to offer him a job as a professor. He went on to MIT, the best economics department on the planet, then and now, in some part because David, of course, is there. David is a superstar scholar and one of the most cited economists in the world. He has overturned long-held assumptions on technological change, the labor market, and globalization, and has had a direct impact on U.S. policy. I think we stand to learn a lot from these guys, and I'm very grateful that they've come to Richmond to spend time with us. Please welcome David and Anton. So I'm not exactly sure how this is going to go, but David and Anton just spent time with about a dozen students upstairs. And what that prompted, it was wonderful. They had great questions. There were great answers. And it prompted this sort of popcorn of discussion that happened as outside of it. People were saying, well, you should ask them this question. You should ask them that question. What about this? That's exactly what we want, and I hope that happens for all of you. Some are anxious about what AI means for their future, for their children's future, for society. You guys know more about this than anyone I've talked to. But before we get into all of that, I'd like you to just spend a minute and a half telling us why you became economists and how you got interested in technology. Anton, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I actually was first interested in technology, and I was spending a lot of time with computers back in the 1990s. And then I kind of became an economist on a whim. I decided it sounded like a fun field, and you could use some models to actually understand something about the real world, and that seemed quite interesting and powerful. And just because I wasn't sure, I hedged my bets, and I studied economics and law. And boy, once I understood comparative advantage, I immediately dropped law and went only for economics. and then about 10 years ago, when I had my first child, my daughter, and I saw how much was happening in deep learning and how rapidly those technologies were advancing, I thought, this is going to be really impactful for her life. And I decided I want to go back to my old passion about technology and study that from an economic lens. And yeah, that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years.
David?
Yeah, so I was a computer geek well before I studied any economics. And but by the time I got to college, I said, well, I don't know if computers will be interesting. That's solving puzzles. I want to work on big problems. So I decided to study psychology. I didn't take any economics. I didn't know what it was. I figured it was about studying money. And I like money as much as the next person, but I didn't want to study it. But then by the time I finished my undergraduate education, I was like, yeah, I like the questions psychology asks, but I'm not in love with the methods. Like, it doesn't have the kind of rigor of a computer science. So I went off, I moved to San Francisco with my girlfriend. I spent several years directing a computer learning center for poor adults and kids in San Francisco. And then when I was done with that, I was like, well, I'm going to go for a master's in public policy. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I know I'll look credible for that. And then once I started at the Harvard Kennedy School, I was like, I'd like to understand this interaction between sort of technology and work and power. Like, how do I do that? And they were like, well, you need a PhD. And I was like, well, how do I do that? And they said, well, you have to take the upper level stats and economics classes. And I was like, oh, okay, so I'll do that. So I signed up for the economics class, and my mind was blown. I was like, oh my God, why didn't anyone tell me about this? This is this field that works on important social challenges and problems, and it uses the rigors of formalism, of computer science and mathematics to kind of tackle and structure really hard problems. It's not that I think the world can be simplified, and it certainly can be oversimplified by economic models, but they give us a framework for taking problems that are too hard and making them tractable to us. So I just felt like I kind of stumbled backwards into the career that I'm in now, and really, in retrospect, it makes some sense, but while I was doing it, it was completely a random walk. I feel very fortunate to have had the opportunity.
I think the people who read the work of both of you are fortunate you stumbled into the work, so thank you. I think before we begin and ask questions, you each brought a few slides. David, you brought a few more than a few.
Absolutely.
But we're going to go quickly through your slides to set the context.
Okay, great. All right. So let me just ask you a rhetorical question. What is the difference between these two jobs? Crossing guard, air traffic controller. I think we can agree, right? Those are basically the same job, right? The job is to stop things from colliding with one another, be they children, be they planes, cars, etc. And yet, crossing guards make less than a quarter of what air traffic controllers do. Why is that? It's not because they're not doing something socially valuable, right? If we had to pay $130,000 a year to protect our children, crossing the street, we certainly would do that. The difference is expertise. To become a crossing guard requires almost no training or certification in a US state. To become an air traffic controller takes years of air traffic controller college, thousands of hours of apprenticeship. Now, you might say, you mean education. No, I mean specialized knowledge to accomplish something valuable. And it is specialized. If we suddenly ran short on crossing guards, we could just get the air traffic controllers to come out of the towers and do that job. But it would not be the case if we ran short on air traffic controllers. So expertise is how I think about the relationship between technology and work. And I want you to notice, by the way, that air traffic controller is in a very high-tech job, and that crossing guard is not. So if you're worried about exposure to technology, right, you should be really worried about this person, not this person. And much of the world is just to define expertise, I apologize, define terms. Expertise means domain-specific knowledge to accomplish something. Not all expertise is valuable. You need two things for it to be valuable. One is it needs to enable something valuable, right? It's got to be data science, not card tricks, something that it's a useful input. And the other is that it needs to be scarce, because if everyone is expert, no one is expert. So expertise and scarcity are inextricable, and of course expertise is changing all the time. What is expert? It matters. There's a time when driving a car was considered expert, right? No longer. Contrast this with what I call the exposure view. It says, if you're exposed to a new technology, let's say AI, then you're in danger, right? If you're exposed, you're hosed. And I don't think that's an accurate way to think about it. And in fact, all of us know this, right? We use tons of technology. You wouldn't say, I'm so sorry I'm exposed to my computer. I wish someone would take it away so my wages would rise, right? And yet we also know that there's a real risk of being exposed and something that your expertise could be devalued. So how should we think about this? Is there such thing as good exposure and bad exposure? And the answer is yes. So consider a job comprised of 9 tasks, and let's order them from least to most expert. And so expert meaning things that are specialized, only a few people know how to do. Inexpert meaning things that everyone knows how to do. So let's say the 3 most expert tasks are automated. What's going to happen? Well, labor productivity is going to rise, obviously. It's more efficient. Average expertise required is going to fall, right? Because anyone can do this work now. So employment will probably rise. More people can do it. But wages may not because there's so much entry. Now consider the same job, but now the 3 least expert tasks are automated. What happens in that case? Well, again, labor productivity is going to rise. But now employment expertise required will rise. Employment might actually fall, right? Because you're making this work harder to do, but wages may rise. So that may sound very abstract, but let me, take an example. I do a lot of writing, and for 20 years I've had a superb assistant who has an undergraduate education from Brown and does a lot of editing for me. But now on the weekends, I'll turn to Claude to edit for me, right? That's great for me. That's a force multiplier. It's taking something that's kind of a supporting task for me and making it more efficient. But for my assistant, that's actually taking away an expert task, right? Same technology. So we're both exposed, but it has a very different meaning for the two of us. And so exposure is not enough. You need to think about is it a force multiplier for the expertise you possess, or is it taking something that you're really good at and commoditizing it? And those really determine how it interacts with the work that you do. So let me, in the interest of time, let me just skip the examples and just point out, and I think this is sort of preface to what we're going to say, the future is not a forecasting problem. It's a design problem. There's lots of choices. So for example, China has 200 million gig workers. Can you believe that? That's more than we have workers. And some of them have disabilities, and in particular hearing impairments. And that's actually a really big challenge in China, because when you deliver food in China, you're expected to call. You can't just text. And that's just part of the custom. So a company all of a sudden had an idea and said, well, hey, why don't we have an AI that can basically do voice to text and text to voice for them, or even speak to the customer on their behalf? And the effect this had was it increased their productivity, their orders completed, increased customer satisfaction. So this is a trivial application. But I'm just saying this is an example of using AI to complement a supporting task to enable what they did more effectively. So in thinking about how we will use technology going forward, I want to contrast 2 technologies. One is my Whirlpool washing machine, which has more processing power than the Apollo moon mission. And due to that, I can start the rinse cycle. If I had my phone here, I could do it right here in this room. And that would be worthless, right? Because I would still have to go to my laundry room to get the clothing out. So this is not a useful technology. What made this technology useful was not the amount of hardware that went into it, but the idea that we had a new capability, that with this processing power, we could do the calculations in real time to land a spacecraft on the moon with people in it. So in thinking about how we will use these technologies, beyond replicating human capabilities, we should be looking for those moonshots. And I think that's where the opportunity lies. Over to you, Anton.
Thank you very much, David. It was really inspirational. You'll see that I slightly reframed the AI and the future of work title that we had for this talk. And I call it the AI takeoff and the future of work. Because I do believe that if we follow the developments in AI very carefully, we can feel that we are living through the takeoff right now. In fact, when David and I were in the green room, I just checked myself and I saw that the latest version of the latest model from Anthropic was released, which is yet again significantly better in a whole bunch of things than the previous version. Now, a couple of months ago already, Sam Altman wrote a blog post which actually didn't get as much attention as it should have received. And in it, he wrote, we are past the event horizon. The takeoff, again, this word takeoff, has started. Humanity is close to building digital superintelligence. And he's expressing a sentiment that I think everybody working at Frontier Labs, working closely with this technology, is experiencing. Now, this term takeoff, it sounds a little bit like out of a marketing playbook, but it's actually a very clearly defined, technical term. What the takeoff means is that AI is approaching the point where it can recursively self-improve, where one model can basically create a better successor model, and so the theory goes, at least in Silicon Valley, we will see rapid capability improvements because the smarter model can create an even smarter one and at a growing speed and ever faster pace. So according to Altman, and I guess lots of other folks in this space, they can already feel this takeoff going on. We can see the results, which is rapid improvements in the capabilities of the AI systems. But up close, they can feel it even more strongly. And I guess the big question for us, and that's the topic of our conversation today, is what's the implication of that for the future of work? And I do very much like David's vision to aim for moonshots rather than replacing humans. But this future that, as David said, is not written yet, it is being written as we are all sitting and standing here and talking. And it is actually not quite pointing in the direction that David is suggesting. That's what I'm very concerned about. So, talking about the rapid pace of advances, what is underpinning that? And I wanted to show one slide on that, which is kind of, I think, one of the most instructive slide in the whole AI debate. So this here shows us how fast the amount of computing capacity that is used to train the most cutting-edge AI systems has been growing over the past 15 years. This looks like a linear line here on the screen, but it's actually a logarithmic chart, so that means this is exponential growth. And it is growth at a pace of 4x every year. So every year, the top AI uses up 4 times more computational power to be trained than the one from the previous year. On top of that, the labs are also getting better at using that compute using more efficient algorithms. That proceeds at a rate of 2.5x a year. So if you multiply those two, 4 times 2.5, they're getting better at an effective rate of 10x a year. And you know, if I look at, for example, David's brilliant brain here, he is brilliant, but it's still the same size as it was last year. So how should he keep pace with this, right? It feels almost impossible. Maybe because it is. So if we take a step back and we think about the kind of role of labor in our economy, I think the shift that we are about to experience is as fundamental as the shift that occurred at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Back then, before the Industrial Revolution, we lived in essentially a Malthusian world where land was the most important factor of production, and the land on which we grew our food was, by some measures, what gave you the most power, if you owned that land or if you had control over that land, right? And then the Industrial Revolution happened, and something amazing occurred. We suddenly didn't need the land as much anymore, and all we needed was labor and capital, like labor and machines. And those machines, they can actually be reproduced really quickly, whereas labor didn't grow quite as fast. And that means labor became the scarcest resource of the economy. If you're scarce, that makes you valuable. And by some measures, average incomes of humans rose by a factor of 20 since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution because labor was so scarce and because labor was so valuable. Well, now we are creating these machines, and no matter in which direction David wants them to develop, it looks like so much of the effort is directed at creating machines that can essentially perform all economically valuable work. Some companies even have that in their mission statement, in their charter. And this is bound to create a shift from the important role of labor that it plays in today's economy to capital as the most important factor of production. And that will carry with it really fundamental challenges when it comes not only to the value of labor, but to income distribution more generally, because today, one of the reasons why income is relatively, I mean, there's a lot of income inequality, right? But to my mind, today's income inequality is going to look wonderful compared to what that future may be pointing at, because we are all born having basically one person's endowment of labor, and that makes every one of us valuable by birth, valuable in the economy, I want to say, because of course we have value in many other domains as well. And yeah, what will this imply for output and wages? So this is just a simulation in a paper of mine recently. If we do develop these technologies, artificial general intelligence, output is going to skyrocket, and the problem is the value of labor is going to plateau and may eventually decline. And I think I have done enough talking now, so let me just stop on that.
Thank you both. I want to talk a little bit more about expertise from the point of view that you were talking, David. So I went to graduate school in 1991 and was there for 4 years. And we spent a lot, I had to learn Fortran. That was one of the courses that were required as the first year graduate student in economics. Spent a lot of time programming in Stata or SAS or Fortran. That was part of what built up. And then in the first 6 years of my career building up to tenure, I'm thinking of empirical questions, I'm testing them. I spent a huge fraction of my time programming, computer programming. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you use AI or your graduate students use AI relative to even just a couple of years ago, or some specific examples of how it's completely shifted your own time.
Sure, it's great. So for me, AI has changed what I view as data. When I was a graduate student, data were rows and columns, and that was true up until 5 or 6 years ago. And now, to me, data are almost anything that you can, that is machine accessible, which is almost anything. I turn lots of text into data, right? I take old books, but I also take things people have written, take patents, and we have ways to work with them. And it's even changed my whole notion of what data is. I used to think data were facts. Now I think data is a kind of approximation of something that's in the world, and not, and so, whenever you work with machine learning or in any, tool this form, you realize you never really get all the ground truth, right? You're always getting some statistical, kind of representation, but then actually I think all of our data are that form. So it's changed the type of questions I can answer. It's made me much more ambitious. It's allowed me to use tools that I couldn't touch before. So I feel like, I guess I could think, and I think Anton thinks that we're, and he'll say, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, that we are about to be eclipsed as researchers. I feel like we can ask better questions and get to answers more quickly, and or a simple way to say this is, all of the research, you might have said 50 years ago, right? Oh, look, now computers are coming online. All you people who do empirical research, the data analysis that used to take you months can now be done in moments. So you're kind of superfluous, right? You won't be needed anymore because all that time-intensive work you did is now kind of it's gone. But what that did is actually led to the birth of empirical economics. Those tools allowed people to take on quantitative questions that were out of reach. So at least at present, I feel like AI has both given me new types of data and new types of tools to take on more interesting questions.
The short answer is I try it out for anything I can possibly do that you can do on a computer. And For many of the things, it failed 3 years ago. For some of the things, it still fails today. And I guess every couple of months, it gets better and more of it. But yeah, more broadly speaking, when I saw the first generative AI tool come out, I got my first demo a couple of months before ChatGPT came out, and it was a system actually much better than ChatGPT at the time. I was like, holy moly, this is going to change the world. And one of the decisions I made back then was I decided, well, it will change the world, and the world is going to need a lot of economic research for understanding part of that transformation that we are heading into right now. But I want to make sure that along the way, I will use these systems as much as I can as a force multiplier. Today, we are at the point where there are force multipliers. I completely agree with David. And I'm kind of reminded of reading this book where Garry Kasparov wrote about when he was defeated in chess by what is called Deep Blue, right? He wrote a book about it afterwards, in which he kind of recounted his experience, and in which he also observed that at the time he was writing the book, that was in the early 2000s, we were living at a time where basically chess computers and humans together could defeat any human chess player, but could also defeat any chess computer. That period lasted for about 15, 20 years. And then a new system called AlphaZero came around, which was powered by deep learning, and which basically made the role of humans in chess irrelevant, except for fun. And there is a lot of chess play going on today, but humans are essentially irrelevant in developing, pushing it forward. And so, David, when you said in economic research, we can do so much more now, I think it's true, and we are in that same kind of human plus machine period that Garry found himself in the 2000s.
Well, I don't think economic research is equivalent to chess, right? Chess is a closed system. There's, it has a finite set of possibilities, just a large number, and there's room for new strategy, but there's not room for asking new questions. You don't say, well, how else could we win this? What else would winning mean? And in research, it's not finding the answer so much as asking the right question and thinking about how to frame something. So I agree. If you want a machine to develop an inorganic molecule with certain properties, it can do better or will do better than what people do. If you ask it to, but I don't actually think in terms of the creation of hypotheses and ways of organizing how we think or even influence others. I suspect that will remain very machine-enabled without being machine replaced.
Actually, when you were talking with the students earlier this afternoon, there was a question about how you can be much more efficient in your work because you don't have to do the programming anymore, that sort of thing. Although you probably didn't have to do the programming anyway because you were at MIT and you had graduate students who were doing the programming. But
I did a lot of programming when I was
I know. You had to pay your due. But what I thought about is, at what point will we be at a place where the machine can answer a question that's as interesting as yours? Because a lot of the time you spend as a PhD advisor is helping a student develop a novel question. Now, I suppose it could help you think about a panoply of questions, but how do you decide what's the right question?
What I want to say, I think I agree that right now, we as human experts can ask better questions, can ask more useful questions. But if you go to a meta level, asking the right questions is in itself an intelligent function, right? And in a couple of years, I don't know for sure if this is going to be 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but I'm sure that in the medium to long term, machines are going to be able to ask the better questions too.
Yeah, no, it's possible. I mean, I don't think either of us would say that the other's view is impossible, right? It's a question of speed, of boundaries. I think that a lot of what people do that is valuable is that they translate between a kind of a formal knowledge of area of mastery, right? So, medicine or law or, construction or contracting or, and interacting with other people. And that they code switch. They're translating constantly between this formal knowledge and this human knowledge, and that is kind of central to valuable work because you're making high stakes one-off decisions for how do I care for this patient? How do I design this building? Someone wants to live in it. How do I fight this legal case? How do I redesign this kitchen, et cetera? And that's where a lot of the valuable work lies. And I suspect that it will continue to be true that people will be the intermediaries between people and between these technologies and the capacities that they have. I'm quite confident that 20 years from now, we will still have doctors and nurses and lots of people who are in professional and other hands-on roles, and they will be vastly augmented by technologies, and they will use them, and in the ideal case, those technologies will enable more people to do that valuable work, right? More people to do care work, more people to do skilled repair and construction, more people to do education. And think more fundamentally, by the way, I think we think of this, and I myself am subject to the same criticism, from a very parochial first world point of view, right? Where we're not concerned, we're concerned about the lack of scarcity, the lack of labor scarcity, right? That we might become devalued. But in much of the world, there's expertise is way too scarce, right? The accessibility of medical health, of education, of medical care, of education, of engineering, of software development. This, in the positive scenario, right? This makes these things, these powerful capabilities, accessible to people. It doesn't mean they do them themselves, I think, in many cases, and it doesn't mean anyone can do them. It means with the right foundational training, you can go much further, right? So I think there's great potential to reduce the scarcity of expertise, to enable more people to do more valuable work, and to provide access to tools that are primarily found in very affluent, very educated countries, and that's not where the majority of the world lives in.
I'm going to foreshadow a question about unemployment, which I want to end with.
Yeah.
So, but I want to start with, you talked about there will be nurses and doctors in 20 years. I have a brand new grandson, first grandchild. He's 3 months old.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, I didn't have much to do with it. So,
you played a critical role.
Yeah, thank you. He's not going to need to learn to drive. He's 3 months old. There's no reason for him to need to drive, in my mind. I don't know. You guys, you're the experts.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I was reading about the occupation, and David, you're the labor economist too. So you like the occupation that more people hold in the United States at the time, I think, was truck driver. And the idea was a lot of people are doing this. They're all about the same age, and they're all going to lose their jobs at the same time. And what are they going to do? I think there were predictions then that it would have already happened by now. I wonder I want to talk a little bit about whether technology augments labor, which you were just suggesting. We might have more nurses, or whether it destroys labor. And if you have an occupation like truck driver, and they lose their job, what are they going to do? And I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit. Because earlier we did a bit of, well, those jobs will be displaced. And we talk about this a little with international trade. Jobs will be lost, but how do you compensate those who lose?
Absolutely. So yeah, there are about 3.5 million truck drivers. It is like perhaps the largest occupation. It's about 2.5% of employment in the United States. And it's very likely over the next 20 years that there will be many, many fewer. However, this is actually quite a manageable transition because this is not going to happen overnight. Even if Elon Musk announced tomorrow morning, we've solved the self-driving problem, and we believed him. It would still be the case that you're not going to just scrap all the existing hardware, the infrastructure, right? It's going to go slowly, and that's a problem. And so that's manageable because people understand this, and they retire out of those careers, and they don't enter them, right? There's a natural rate of change in labor markets. An occupation can, shrink 2 or 3 percentage points a year without anyone being fired because people retire. That's not as significant a threat. Now, let me say, it was the case at the turn of the 20th century. 38% of U.S. employment was in agriculture. And if you had said, look, by the way, 100 years from now, it's going to be under 2%. What do you think the other 36% will do? They would not have said, well, I don't know, botnet herding, search optimization, pediatric oncology, right? They had no idea. So we have been effective at creating new work. However, the labor market can't adjust that rapidly, right? We saw with the China trade shock how catastrophic that was for manufacturing-intensive labor markets, right? Why? It was very locally concentrated, and it put entire industries out of business all at once. And people don't generally make big career transitions in the middle of their career. The way labor market change occurs is generational. People retire from one set of activities and new entrants enter another. And so if you make that happen at the rate of 10% a year, that's really problematic. A couple percentage points we can handle. So the self-driving trucks I'm not nearly as concerned about as if all the software developers, all the accountants, all the middle managers, all the financiers, all of the clerical workers, all the checkout clerks, if all of those went all at once, that could happen much faster. It's not as capital intensive, and that would be a very difficult adjustment.
Yeah, so Kevin, you posed the question in terms of unemployment, but we economists, we think about labor demand more generally, and there is the quantity dimension, which is the number of jobs and the number of unemployed, and there is the price dimension, which in the labor market we call the wage. And so no matter whether this will happen very quickly or more slowly, I guess generally speaking, we are concerned about the demand for labor going down, especially the demand compared to all the other things in the economy. And I do believe that it is quite plausible that this ongoing AI takeoff will substantially reduce labor demand. If things play out over many years, then yes, there can be retirements and so on. Maybe it won't even be reflected as much in unemployment numbers, but it would be reflected in the labor share of the economy, meaning the fraction of all the income that goes to workers rather than to capital, declining and declining and declining. And I think already we have seen the labor share decline by a couple percentage points in the past few decades. I think we have hit a low now in January when the latest statistics came out, and this may accelerate quite significantly. Now specifically with AI taking off, what I guess this kind of consensus view in Silicon Valley would predict is that this may first hurt actually the white-collar workers, the ones that have been the big beneficiaries of progress in the past few decades. But then, if we talk about trucking, for example, that also requires robotics. If you have really intelligent machines, those machines are going to advance progress in robotics much faster than what we humans can currently do. So let's say the Silicon Valley prediction would be that we are also going to have really rapid progress in the robotics and that we can do everything very soon after that. And that would lead to a really cataclysmic decline in labor demand. So that's the big concern.
So a couple of points. I think these are all valid. I think one should, the Silicon Valley prediction should not be seen as the future, right? It might be, but these guys are gamblers, and they're often wrong. They're often, it's great. It's good. We need people taking gambles. I'm all in favor of it, especially if it's other people's money. But the notion, so just to define terms, labor share is, the economy has a certain amount of output, and there's some fraction of it paid to workers first, and some paid to owners of capital and corporations and so on. And historically, that's hovered around 60% labor share. So $6 out of $10 in the economy goes first to workers before it goes in other places. But has fallen since the year 2000, and now it's around 55%. Now, it's not. Let's be clear that the optimal labor share is not 1 and it's not 0, right? If the labor share were 1, 100% means we have no machines or capital. So we would, that would take us back to prehistoric times. The labor share was 1, and we were dying at 35. After a long, healthy life. If it were 0, that would also be a problem, right? Because it'd be no income paid to workers. it could be a lot lower, and if we're a lot more productive, we would still be fabulously wealthy, right? There's not, the optimal amount is not what we have, and it's not always the case that higher is better. The problem with a falling labor share, there are two potentials. One is, it does raise inequalities. Ownership of capital is much more concentrated than ownership of labor. And another is if it fell faster than productivity rose, then it would mean real incomes are falling. That could happen, but it's also the case that if AI is as productive as Anton thinks it will be, it should raise incomes a lot, even as the labor share is falling. So, I just want to be clear, even the statement that that labor demand will fall relative to demand for capital does not intrinsically mean people will become poorer.
Does not necessarily mean.
Does not, that's right, does not necessarily mean. It can, but there's an optimal, so, but my main concern, so actually let me just, final point. My main concern with declining labor scarcity, if that were to occur, is that the labor market I think of as actually the most important social institution. It's kind of the foundation of democracy. It's the ballast of the ship of state. Our democracy depends on the notion that most of us are both claimants and contributors to society. If we had a world, a society where it was perceived that most people were claimants but few were contributors, their labor wasn't valuable, all the value was created by machines and their overlords, then we would have fabulous wealth and a terrible income distribution problem and not a very good democratic means to deal with that. And so that is my great concern, is the threat to democracy, not the, which really comes as starts as a threat to the labor market.
Could there be institutional constraints put on that so that there's income redistribution, but then maybe you don't have democracy?
Sure. So actually, this is something that Neil Thompson and I and others have written at the Bear Gruen Institute recently about this notion of, I'm not so a big fan of universal basic income. One, you have to do it all the time, every year, and so you have to tax and transfer. On the other hand, and I do agree, I think we should be doing things to make work better, not leisure better. I say that because I'm a labor economist. I'm not a leisure economist, so I don't want that to happen. But
it's just 24 minus leisure, minus labor.
Never mind then. But there is another idea that people have put out that I think makes a lot more sense, is what you might call universal basic wealth or universal basic capital, which is that when people are born, you give them some resources, stock ownership, bonds, whatever. Not a huge amount, but it grows over time, hopefully, if capital is becoming more productive. This has multiple advantages. One, it diversifies, right? Most of us have most of our portfolio wrapped up in the value of our labor, and that's actually a risky bet. Two, it would democratize decision-making over capital. Three, it would reduce inequality. So I think, and that's a kind of a no regrets idea, right? There's no reason, it's nothing we would be like, oh no, the world didn't end and we still did all that, that's terrible. It's kind of a good idea already. In fact, some people even call them Trump accounts. And it's still a good idea, despite that. Sorry, I apologize. So I think this is a way that we could invest in diversifying people's portfolio and invest in democratization. And it take a long time to accomplish, right? Because you have to do it cohort by cohort. So it's something we should be starting now.
So I'll make 2 points. The first one, I do agree that it is a huge concern that the devaluation or even the relative devaluation of labor may actually erode our democracy, and that there are in fact feedback loops. The more, let's say, labor devaluation erodes democracy, there are less there's going to be political forces that kind of ensure that labor can keep its role, and that means things may go into reverse pretty quickly. And yeah, that is concerning. Now, at the same time, so if labor becomes less valuable, we are going to need some different system to distribute some of this big surplus that's going to be generated if AI is really so powerful and so capable. In fact, I would view it as like really an utmost ethical failure if we create these amazing machines that can produce so much, and we could all be actually better off by just distributing a small fraction of that, and if we don't do it. It would be an utter failure, yet it could happen so easily. And on this question of UBI or universal basic capital, so my perspective is, at some fundamental level, these are just labeling things differently. Whether you call it, okay, this is your account from which you get paid an annual rent, or whether the government itself pays you an annual rent, that's actually very similar to each other, right? Because if you have these accounts, how much control does it really give you? Very little as an individual.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and also begin by talking about inequality.
Yeah.
You tour at major research universities. We're an extraordinary university here, and I get a lot of questions about the value of a liberal arts education. I actually believe it's more important now than it's ever been. We could argue about that. You could argue. I don't want you to argue about that. Forget that. I will assert that it's more valuable than it's ever been.
We won't argue the premise.
You could. I'm fine with that. I wonder what you think, though, about, I mean, we teach in very small classes. Our business model is built upon that. We have a very large endowment. And there's a lot of human interaction in the classroom. Our faculty are changing the way that they're doing research and creative work, changing the way that they're teaching because of AI. But I wonder if you could say something about what AI means for higher ed in the two parts. One is the research infrastructure is what a big part of the fuel of your universities, but also what happens from a teaching point of view, and what you think about the fact that there are 3,500 colleges and universities in the United States, or maybe it's 4,000, I don't know what it is, it's a lot, and how this may shake out in the next 15 years. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not quite as sure about MIT, but at least our institutions were founded not primarily because they would raise students to be productive workers, but the notion of liberal arts education was always that it would make us more wholesome human beings, right? And when our institutions were founded, that was actually the predominant idea, and the idea of making you a more valuable worker, that was just like a side thought. And in some sense, I think over the past few decades, this notion that education is all about making a higher income has probably grown too large. And I think in the next couple of years, it will have to go into reverse. We shouldn't think of what we are doing at universities primarily as raising higher earning workers, but as basically fulfilling the original liberal arts mission, which is to just make us more whole human beings. And yeah, I'll say I know lots and lots of people. I have never really left the university, so I can't speak to that, but I know lots and lots of people who say the times that they spent in their college were like some of the best years of their lives. And I think that in itself makes it incredibly valuable.
So I'm going to be a little more crass. The reason the universities have so increasingly been seen in terms of their economic role is that the inequality of incomes between college and non-college workers has grown explosively for 45 years. And you wouldn't know it from listening to the news, but it's at an incredibly high level right now. And the median college graduate earns about 70 to 90% more than the median high school graduate, and that has not fallen. It's plateaued, but it's not fallen. And so, higher education has become very essential for not just making good citizens, but for enabling people to lead productive lives, productive careers, economically productive, but also more enjoyable, right? People who are college graduates, they like their work more. They're healthier. They're more satisfied. It works well for people. I think that college will continue to be important for this role. And I think that, we live in an overwhelmingly complex world. We're overwhelmed by information of low quality. There are really difficult decisions to make, and people who can work well in that world, who can make analytically sound decisions, who can synthesize an overwhelming amount of information, who can figure out how to lead and inspire others, to make plans and to direct decisions that matter. I think those skills will remain fundamentally important, that kind of code switching between the formal and the human and interpersonal, and that education will be just as important for that, maybe more so. And I think places like the University of Richmond have a kind of comparative advantage in this setting, because there's no reason anymore for anyone to attend a lecture with 400 other students. Like, what are you getting out of that you couldn't get out of video? But lots of things happen in the classroom that you can't get out of video. A classroom is a high-stakes interpersonal environment, right? It's not just about the knowledge. If just disseminating knowledge was all we needed, right, libraries would have solved our educational problems centuries ago, right? Learning is hard. And to get people to learn, you have to get them to engage. And that means putting them in a place where the stakes are high, where there's consequence, where you can show off, where you can be embarrassed, where you can be funny, where you can make a bad or politically inappropriate joke. And so I think that places that can invest in students, and guide them through this formative process, I think that will not just be a luxury, but will be a value-added setting for people who are going to, function well and thrive in this extremely complicated world.
And also, I guess, if there's no work, what else should we do with our time?
Again,
I was going to say we should have ended right when you said that, but
exactly. Yeah, again, I think that's a very, I think it's noble, but it's also very elite, and I don't think
that was a
that's, and I know, and I don't think that's why most people think they're here, and it's not why most parents are telling their kids they need to go to college. For the Nobel reason. I think they're telling them because they want them to thrive as adults, and I think that it remains quite important.
you guys were in the New York Times this week. I don't know what day it was, maybe Tuesday.
Maybe it was yesterday.
Yesterday. Well, time flies when you're having fun. There was a bit of an exchange, and you alluded to it a little bit here about the investment in AI. I think Anton had one view, and I think you came in second on that one in the string. And I think largely, there's a lot of investment in AI. The market or whatever thinks there's something here, and you said maybe they're just wasting other people's money. I think that's my characterization. I wonder what you think about market efficiency and asset prices and trading. And so imagine a world where, and we have students who go off into the finance industry and prominent graduates from that, whether you think that there's positive returns could be arbitraged out because of AI. Do you have any views on that? So it'll be harder to make money relative
itself.
to the market. Endowments would have more difficulty going forward because AI models will be fighting it out and squeezing profits from one another.
I mean, one of the fascinating things about the markets is that they are really at the forefront of automation. If you have traded in equity markets 10 years ago, it was already 99% of all trade was done by bots. And that made that market super, super efficient. Are those bots spreading? Oh yeah,
those are in public markets.
That was equity markets. It was public equity markets. Are they spreading into kind of all corners of the market? Oh yes, certainly they are. And are they playing more and more of the functions? Yeah, they are. Are they today quite as good as a human portfolio manager? Not quite yet. But if you are in those roles, the AI is a tremendous force multiplier.
But I think I understood the question about the efficiency of markets themselves, right, as opposed to the efficiency of the people who are trading. And there, when Amazon first appeared, people were like, that's never going to make any money. Like selling books and CDs, there's going to be everybody's going to be a frictionless world where everybody has the same price, no profits will be left, they'll all be arbitraged away. That did not happen, right? The profit share of the economy has not fallen over time, and Amazon is profitable. So I don't think that the arbitrage opportunities are efficient. Fundamentally, in financial markets are not just about arbitrage. There's just uncertainty. So they're about risk diversification, right? And I think that will be incredibly important, or about making trades across time. I think there's only so much certainty we can have about the future. AI will not be able to predict the future. There's many, many things that are not knowable. They're not deterministic, or if they're deterministic in a sense that we will not be able to calculate in real time, right? And finance has not shrunk, right? Either numerically in terms of employment or in terms of the share of GDP, even though you might say, oh my God, it should be like plumbing, right?
It's a shame, yeah.
Well, I like plumbing. So anyway, I don't think, I do not think technology will soak the profit out or eliminate the sector. Maybe it is too big. I mean, I think all of us can agree finance is essential. You couldn't have modern economies that didn't have the ability to borrow and lend large amounts and take risky bets and diversify and insure. At the same time, you may say, well, we could have too much finance at the margin, right? Like maybe we don't need as much cryptocurrency as we had, or maybe we don't need 7 credit cards apiece, or maybe we don't need a way to like pay a layaway plan on our new pair of socks to pay over 4 installments through Klarna. And I would also agree with that.
You can get these if you give a certain amount of money to the university.
Oh, okay, there you go. See, that's what liberal arts education is for.
I would like to give you each, I have an announcement for the audience, so don't leave yet. I want you each to maybe spend a minute summing up something you'd like to say that we haven't covered yet. We've covered about a third of what I wanted to cover, but that's fine. In summary, and why don't you go first, Anton?
Yeah, I guess I would just summarize kind of my perspective on this whole question by saying that the extent of uncertainty, the extent of possibilities of where the world could be going in the next couple of years is perhaps larger than it has been in the past at least half century. There is this potential that AI will just completely take off, and if I have to put my bets somewhere, I would put them there. There's also the possibility that this is just going to be like another internet, and in both of these scenarios, I think a good strategy forward is to responsibly embrace the technology, to use it for what you can use it for, to take advantage of it, to use it as a force multiplier. And I think that is something that would help you and serve you well in either scenario. I personally would also say that if the kind of extreme takeoff scenario is the relevant one, we have a closing window. We have only a shrinking amount of time in which all the things that we can do to influence the future still matter. So I'm saying this because I want to encourage all of you to think about these questions, to contribute to this debate about where we want AI to go and where we want our world to go, because it may be one of the most fundamental and most important questions in our lifetimes.
David.
Thank you.
Great. So let me first sort of echo Anton or amplify. We have, we should be optimistic and pessimistic simultaneously, right? We have a set of opportunities that we've never had to, improve health, to address climate change, to do farming and energy generation much more efficiently, to address educational challenges. So we are going to advance science. So that we should, if we neglect that, we're missing this incredible vista that is open to us. Simultaneously, we face real risks. We face labor market risks. We face risks of weapons proliferation, of misinformation, of non-consensual sexual content. Right? There's lots and lots of downsides. And some of all of these things are going to happen. It's not going to be one or the other, right? And the central tendency may not be that relevant. If it's 5% better, but 105% better for some and 100% worse for others, that's not that. We need to insure against that. So one, we should recognize that. Two, we should be looking for ways to use the technology to amplify human expertise and to open opportunity to actually create a new middle class of work that gives people better tools and lowers entry requirements to do valuable work. I believe that's opportunities available to us. The third is all of the insurance mechanisms that we talk about are really ones that are only available to rich countries. And we we are probably much better situated to adjust to this than the other countries that are on the receiving end of this and they don't own the technology and they're not as well situated to adapt. And so we should be thinking hard about how do we enable other countries to benefit, and especially the developing world. And that may sound kind of hokey, but if you think about like mobile telephony, right? That was the technology that was more transformative and beneficial to the developing world than to the rich world. For the rich world, it was great, it was convenient. But for the developing world, all of a sudden you had long-distance telecommunications, access to pricing and news, communication with your relatives, and so on. AI is like this too. It addresses a form of scarcity potentially that is even greater in other parts of the world than here. So we should be, to the degree that this technology turns out to help the less developed parts of the world develop faster, become more self-sufficient, or gain capabilities more quickly, that's fabulous. To the degree that it basically cuts them off and kneecaps pathways to development, that should be a real concern, because they don't have the ability, in general, they don't have the luxury of this type of self-insurance. So I think we should think beyond our borders. Even when people talk about UBI, that usually ends at a national border. But this is going to be a kind of a world-changing period that we're in. We have a lot of responsibility to make good decisions.
So thanks so much for being here with us
Thank
today.
you, guys.
Thank you.